The Ugly Duckling by Hans Christian Andersen. There was once a very beautiful Mrs. Duck, and she had a fine clutch of eggs. She had half a dozen ordinary-sized ones and one really large one. And she was very proud of this really large one. She thought it was going to be a very, very special duck indeed. So she took good care of them all. She made sure she wasn't sitting on them too hard, and she turned them every day, and she talked to them. She even sang to them, quack, 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 quack. And she could hear and feel them wiggling around inside their shells as the little ducklings got tighter and tighter. Then one fine spring morning there was a crack and a pushing feeling from underneath her bottom, and Mrs. Duck got up and she looked around, and there were little beaks, two little beaks coming out of eggs, and she helped by pulling away some of the shell with her own beak, and two gorgeous yellow fluffy ducklings wriggled out, and she pushed the bits of shell out of the nest, and they went squeak, squeak, mummy, mummy. An hour or two later, another couple of ducks hatched, and another one, but not the really big egg. Well, Mrs. Duck didn't mind, because she was sure it was going to be a very, very special egg. And all the little ducklings ran around in the undergrowth next to the water, and they kept coming up and saying, "Mummy, mummy, mummy, can we go swimming? Please, can we go swimming? Say yes, mummy." And Mrs. Duck said, "I'm sorry, dear, we can't go swimming because your brother or sister hasn't hatched yet. It won't be long." And she turned the egg over and she made herself more comfy, thinking perhaps if she kept it extra warm, it would come out soon. But the little baby ducks kept saying, "Mummy, mummy, mummy, please, we want to go swimming. Please, please, please." And Mrs. Duck said, "Well, if I can get somebody to sit on this egg, then maybe I will try." And just then old Auntie Duck came waddling past, and she said, "Have you got problems, Mrs. Duck?" "Oh, yes," said Mrs. Duck. "5 of my beautiful chicks have hatched, but this last one won't." "Let's have a look," said Auntie Duck. She came and she peered at the egg and she turned it over, and she said, "I think this is a turkey egg that's ended up in your nest, and you don't want a turkey egg. I had a turkey egg once. The hatchling was useless. It wouldn't swim, it wouldn't do anything like a proper duck. So I got rid of it in the end. Get rid of this. It won't be any use to you." And Mrs. Duck said, "It's not a turkey egg. It's my special baby. It's just a bit slow coming out." Do what you like," said Auntie Duck, and she waddled on. Next morning there was a cracking and a wriggling, and Mrs. Duck got off, delighted to welcome her last and her biggest baby. And when it came out of the shell, it wasn't beautiful. It wasn't a fluffy yellow colour. It was a sort of mucky brown. And it didn't go cheep, cheep like her own little ducks. It went and made funny noises. And she said, "Are you my baby?" And the ugly duckling looked up and said, "Mummy." "Come on," she said. "I'm going to see if you're a turkey egg or whether you're a real duck." And she took him down to the edge of the water, and she gently pushed all of her little ducklings in. But the big new ugly one didn't need pushing in. He jumped in of his own accord, and he was off. "Oh," said Mrs. Duck, "you aren't a turkey egg. You like swimming." And Mrs. Duck led all the ducks down the stream until they came to the farmyard gate. And she led the little ducklings out of the water, and she said, "Right, children, I'm going to introduce you to the ducks and the chickens in the farmyard. And you must be very polite to them all. And when you see a duck with red legs, she is the queen of the farmyard. She is a Spanish duck, and she is extremely important. So when you go past her, you must bow your heads and go quack very nicely and very politely. And that includes you," she said to the big ugly duckling. Well, all the ducks promised to behave, and they went into the farmyard, and all the ducks came round, dying to be introduced to the new baby ducklings because they were so pretty. And Mrs. Duck introduced them all. And then they said, and what about me? And Mrs. Duck said, oh, and this is my last duckling. And all the other ducks said, that can't be one of yours. It's a funny colour. It's a sort of muddy brown colour. It's a mucky colour. And we, when we get our feathers, are a beautiful dark brown. And the ugly duckling said, I can't help the colour I am. And his baby brothers and sisters, the fluffy yellow ones, said, well, we're not going to play with you because you're not yellow like us. And the big duck said, and we're not going to let you near us because you're a funny muddy colour. You aren't a beautiful chocolate brown like us. And the ugly duckling said, I'm very sorry I'm the wrong colour. And then all the ducklings went off to play. And then the chickens came to inspect, and exactly the same thing happened. They said, where did you get that one from, Mrs. Duck? And Mrs. Duck said, well, he's mine, and he'll be all right when he grows a bit. He was in the egg too long, so he's a bit funny. And then the duckling said, I'll be good. And the chicken said, you better be good, because we're not having you here if you put 1 foot wrong. And so they all went to play, the chicks and the ducklings. But they started picking on the ugly duckling, and they kept pushing him in the mud and not including them in the games because he was different and the wrong colour, and they weren't going to let him play. And then day after day the same thing happened. And even the queen of the farmyard, the big Spanish duck, even she thought the ugly duckling wasn't good enough and ought to be got rid of. The ugly duckling did his best. He never hurt anybody. He was always polite, and when he saw the queen of the farmyard, the Spanish duck, he would always bow his head and go quack, and she'd just go and pretend she hadn't seen him. And then one day the farmer's daughter, who used to come to feed the ducks and the hens, came along, and she had a big basket of food in her hand, but instead of feeding the ugly duckling, she kicked him right out of the farmyard, over the hedge, and into the world beyond. Well, the ugly duckling was terrified, but he decided to take his chance, and instead of going back, he decided to go on. He would run away, and he would find somewhere where he wasn't hated for being different. And he ran and ran and ran until he came to another pond. And there were lots of rushes there, and there were more ducks swimming around in the water. And the duckling tried to stay right out of sight. But the duck saw him and came along and went, quack, quack, quack. Who are you? What are you? You're all big and gangly and untidy, and your feathers are the wrong colour. And the duckling said, I know my feathers are a funny colour, and I'm trying very hard to make them yellow, and I'm very sorry, and I will be good. And the ducks looked at each other and they thought, we don't want a funny duck here. And they went quack, 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 and they chased him, hissing and spitting, right away from the pond. Well, days passed, and the duckling found little ponds and little bits of marsh, and he survived on this and that, and he kept going. And then one day he came to a little cottage, and in the cottage there was an old lady, and her door was open. And the duckling, who was cold and tired, waddled in, and seeing a hen and a cat, he sat by the side of them. And the old lady said, oh, goodness me, we've got a visitor. She said, you are a funny-looking one. Do you lay eggs, like my chicken? Or do you purr, like my cat? And the duckling bowed his head and didn't know what to answer, so he just said, quack, trying to sound like a quack, but he couldn't get it out right. And the old lady said, well, you can stay with us for 3 weeks, and if you prove useful, if you lay eggs, or if you purr, or if you've got another skill, you can stay. And at first, the ugly duckling was quite happy because he was fed, and he was stroked, and he was allowed to sit by the fire. But the chicken used to come up to him and say, can you lay eggs? And the ugly duckling said, I don't think so. I'm a boy. Oh, she won't want you then, said the chicken. You're useless. And then the cat came up to the ugly duckling and said, and can you purr? And the duckling said, quack. and he couldn't make the right purring noise. And the cat said, "You're no use if you can't purr." And then the old lady kept inspecting the box where the duckling sat to see if there was an egg, and of course there never was. And time was running out, and the duckling didn't know what he was going to do. One morning, the duckling peered out of the door, and it was a lovely sunny day, although it was winter, and said, "Do you know, I'd love to go swimming. I'd love to dive deep underwater. I'd like to get all wet all over." And the chicken looked at him and said, "You're a funny one. What do you want to go swimming for? What do you want to get wet for?" And the duckling said, "Well, it's nice." And the chicken said, "We don't like you. You don't do what we do. You don't think like us. You don't like what we do. You're different." And then the cat came along and said, "What's this about wanting to go swimming, about getting wet? Who in their right minds wants to get wet?" The duck felt very, very sad. And that on the last day, when he hadn't laid an egg, the old woman picked him up and looked at him and thought, "I think you're a boy, whatever you are. You're a very strange sort of duck. I think I'm going to feed you up and make you very fat, and then I'm going to eat you. But I'm going to have to lock you away in case you escape." And the duckling heard the cat going behind his paw and the chicken going behind her wing. But when the old lady put the ugly duckling down to go and get a bigger box to lock him up in, he flapped his little wings and he ran as fast as he could through the crack under the door, and he escaped. And he went and walked and walked and walked until he came to another pond where there was nobody there. He snuggled down in the rushes, and then one morning overhead he saw 3 birds he had never seen before, huge white creatures with long necks and orange beaks and enormous white wings that spread wide in the sky. Thought the ugly duckling, "They are so beautiful." And he looked up and he wished and he longed and he ached to be able to go up and fly like them with those magnificent birds in the sky. "But they'd never want me," he said, "because I can't fly and I'm ugly and nobody wants me because I'm different." He managed to get through the winter somehow. And as spring came, the duckling thought he needed a proper swim. He was feeling a little bit stronger, and over the last week or two he discovered he could fly, and his wings were big and strong. And while he'd been flying, he'd seen a lovely lake by a big house, and so he went back there. At first it was empty, and he thought, "Oh, I can have a lovely swim in peace." But as he did, 3 beautiful white birds, like the birds he had seen flying, came swimming towards him. And the ugly duckling was very, very frightened, and he turned and he swam away as fast as he could in case they pecked at him and hissed at him like everybody else, and he hid in a big clump of weeds. But the great white birds, which of course were swans, came around and said, "Why are you hiding?" And the ugly duckling said, "I'm hiding because I'm ugly, and everybody hates me and nobody wants me, and I don't know where to go, and I don't know what to do, and I'm frightened." And the swan said, "Come out. Let's see you. Let's talk to you." And the duckling thought, "Oh, this is it. I'm going to be pecked to death now." And he came out, and the 3 swans looked at him and said, "You are beautiful." "Me?" said the ugly duckling. I'm ugly. I'm the wrong colour, and I don't think like everybody else, and I don't do what everybody else does, and everybody hates me and nobody loves me." And the swan said, "What are you talking about? Look at yourself in the water." And so the ugly duckling looked down into the water and saw, to his amazement, to his wonder, his joy, he was a swan. "Whee!" he said. And he said, "But this is wonderful, but..." And Swan said, "Well, our babies are fluffy and brown and a bit ugly. But even if you weren't a swan, here on this lake, we don't mind what you look like, as long as you're good and kind. Now, Be one of us. Join the gang. Let's all go flying. And so they ran and they paddled and they ran across the water, flap, 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 with their big feet. And all four of them spread their wings and launched up into the blue sky.